Yes, we can start. Hi, everyone. So what we're going to do today is just talk about storytelling as a sort of tactic for transformational learning. I'm going to use a microphone because I think it's easier for like online and translation and things. Just a little bit about me. So I'm actually not an educator beyond the educational materials I've created for APCU. I'm a person whose background is really in the world of human rights and campaigning. On a range of issues, including digital rights and media literacy for empowerment and that sort of thing. Beyond that work, my background before that is actually in the arts. So I come from a world of theatre and art making, which means that story was always a very natural kind of medium for me to use. And when I moved into the world of campaigning and change making in the human rights space, I started using story as a means to really create change. And what story really, really does, and what I think we're going to talk about today, is how story helps people change the way they think about things, the way that they see the world, the way they see themselves in the world. And those are key for change making. I always say, I recently just did a project with a group of mentees who came through APCU, where I project managed them. And one of the first things I did was look at all their objectives for their projects. Because one of the things that's very important to realize if you're in the world of change making and influencing is that you have to set your objectives realistically and understand that you cannot change someone's mind. You cannot physically go in and rearrange someone's thoughts. What you can do is influence. What you can do is plant seeds of change. So that is what story is all about, and that's what we're going to talk about today. This is going to be a little bit of a sort of lecture where I'm going to encourage you to ask questions and answer questions rather than an activities-based workshop. I think it just works better. There is so much information to get through. It's important to just point out that when people do storytelling and people learn storytelling, people spend years learning this stuff. This is not something that one does in an hour. This is something that people dedicate their lives to. This is something that people do degrees in. This is some people do PhDs in. So this is something that you cannot compress, which is one of the reasons I'm going to try and fit as much information in as possible. And I'm also going to encourage you all to stay in touch if you want more information and resources, and to look at the GCED Learning Center online, where I've done storytelling courses before, and you can get more information there as well. So the first, let me just. I've got to navigate my notes on my computer and this, which I've never used before. So give me a moment. The first question that I want you to just think about is, what is transformational learning? Because we've heard it a lot over the past day, but I haven't really heard a definition for it yet. So does anyone have an idea or thoughts about what transformational learning really, really is that they want to offer? Or any ideas? Oh, yes. Is there a spare microphone? Okay.
Yeah, not to sound too basic, but I think transformational learning is any sort of learning that can lead to a change in behavior, that is, what's the word now? That is tangible change in behavior.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Yes? There's a microphone?
I think maybe transformational learning is taking the knowledge and actually using critical thinking to apply it in various contexts.
Okay. So basically, here's an interesting thing. I asked the internet for a definition, and there are lots of definitions, and none of them agreed with each other. Because I think it's one of those spheres where everyone's got big ideas, and everyone talks a lot, but very few people are actually doing the work. So what the internet told me is that transformational learning is a process of profound and fundamental personal change in individuals' beliefs, perspectives, values, and behaviors. It goes beyond acquiring a new information or skills. It involves a shift in one's understanding of themselves, the world, and their place in it. And the reason I highlighted those bits is because I really, really appreciate this idea of shifting not only oneself, but the idea of oneself in the context of the world, because we don't exist in a vacuum. We only ever exist in the context of the world. So if we are going to shift beliefs, behaviors, and perspectives, we also need to shift our understanding of our own place in the world. And that is something that story does particularly well. I just want you to think about this question. If you were to encourage transformational learning in someone, if you are wanting to change and encourage someone's shifts in behaviors, what do you need to know? What do you need to understand in order to create change and to shift within yourself? Yeah. Oh, as the person who is, so as the teacher, what do you have to make someone understand in themselves? What does someone need to understand to shift their own behavior and shift their own worldview? Yes.
I think first off, making the person understand that change is not necessarily a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that it could be good and it could lead to positive outcomes, first off.
Yes. So I think one of the important things that I always say is that you can't move unless you know where you're starting from. So the idea that change is possible is very important, and that is something story makes very clear. But the other thing that using story makes very, very clear is where one already stands in relation to the world around them. So understanding what we would call your prior position, that is what storytelling makes very clear. And that can be your own position or the position of someone whose situation or context you are trying to change. Storytelling is a wonderful way of locating someone in reality, locating someone in a context. So we're going to talk about why we use story, but the first thing I want you to think about is what story really is. Has anyone got a definition of what a story is? Everyone thinks they know what stories are because we talk about stories all day long, but what is a story? Ooh, it's a surprisingly difficult question to answer. We're all in a room thinking about stories, and we all if I didn't define it, do you think you would know what it was? Okay. But none of you want to give me an answer. What? Guess. Someone dare an answer. You're all sitting in a room about stories, and you didn't think I was going to define story, so... Ooh, okay. Yes, you try?
I don't know the definition of a story.
Yes.
But why stories? It gives a context.
Yes. Okay. Okay, getting there, a series of events. Anything else? They're interconnected. Ooh, getting there, building it.
It could also be an account.
An account. Oh, no, see, now we're veering off course, and I'll tell you why we're veering off course. So I haven't got a slide about what stories are because I didn't think I was actually going to ask you all. One of the things that's very important to realize about story is an incredibly overused word. If you go on LinkedIn right now, as I'm sure you do, and please do make friends with me on LinkedIn, if you go on LinkedIn right now, you will find 1 billion people talking about story in the context of business, talking about story as like, oh, tell your organizational story, all of these things, and none of them are, in my mind, using story correctly if we are going to talk about story as a transformational tool and as a change-making tool. Story is, at its very core, and this is, and one of the reasons it's important to define it is because if we are going to talk about what it does to people, we need to know what we're talking about and what we're not talking about specifically. Story is, at its core, something, an account, but a very specific kind of account. It is a narrative, and a narrative which starts in one place, then moves into a different space where change happens or realization happens or some sort of movement happens, and then either moves to a new place or moves to the old place again. But there has been a shift and there has been movement. So what story is not is a testimonial. Story is not a profile of a person. Story is not a case study. Story takes a situation, creates movement or decision-making or some sort of action upon that situation or individual, and then either puts them back in the same place they were or into a new place. So it's 3 steps. And you will find versions of storytelling which define narrative arcs into sort of very sort of Western patterns of like sort of like 7-part story arc, and it starts with a exposition, and then it goes into a crisis, and then it goes into another kind of crisis, then it has a conclude. Like those story arcs, I mean, they exist, and they're not incorrect. And if you've ever studied literature or anything like that, you might have come across that. I believe that that is unnecessary, and it is also not universal. So what I would like you all to think about is story as something which begins in a single place, creates movement, and either goes back to a single place or goes to a third place. It can go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. It can, as you say, be a series of related events. But it has to move. If it does not move, it is not a story. And why is it important that it moves? Where's my thing? I'll show you why it's important that it moves. It's important that it moves because it presents issues in their context. So you've got your prior position. So the issue you are trying to change, you present it in its context. And here's where it gets quite complicated. And I feel, like I said, feel free to interrupt as we move throughout this, because it's very, very important to understand this. You present issues in their context. So you have the prior position. You have the person, the character experiencing the world. They are in their context. They are in an environment. They are in a situation. We can, with a story, present a solution to their problem, right? If we are trying to create change, we suggest a solution. The change happens. Chaos, change, decision-making. And then we either see them in a new context, so we have proof of the value of that solution, or, and this is where it gets complicated but very, very important, we can see the impact of that in action, or imaginatively, we can see the impact of it not happening. And one of the reasons we want to do that is we want to create a sense of either satisfaction that there has been a change, or the idea that there could be a change, and now we are unsatisfied, so we want to make the change. Does that make sense? And one of the reasons we do this, let me just go back to, I've got it sort of more neatly written in my own notes. Hold on a second, give me a moment. Is we're going to go into brain chemistry next, so prepare yourselves. So basically, what you are creating is either an imagined new state of affairs or dissonance in an audience where they want a new state of affairs. You are shifting something either in the character who exists within a context and is experiencing an issue, or you shift something in the audience who now understands that character better. So one of the famous stories, take Cinderella, right? Are we all familiar with Cinderella? I don't want to assume, because it's a Western fairy tale. Cinderella, she exists. Very sad story. She's treated like a slave by her family, by her stepsisters. She's treated like a slave. She goes to the ball. The fairy godmother comes down. She goes to the ball. She sees a new world. The prince falls in love with her. That's not a story yet. The story happens when she goes back to the house, where she goes back to being Cinderella the slave. That alone would be a story. It's not where the story ends. But that would be a story, because now we identify with Cinderella because we've listened to her story. So we are now sad that she is back where she was. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? If we had just described Cinderella, the slave to her sisters and her stepmother, that wouldn't be a story. What we need to make it a story is that she goes to the ball. And then even if she went back, that would be a story. But the story doesn't end there. Luckily for us, the prince comes, finds her, falls in love with her, and takes her away. Okay, so that's the full story. But we've got enough of a story at the point where she goes back for it to be considered a story. Okay, does that make sense? Because we are no longer happy that she is in that position. Similarly, when we are looking at the stories that are currently coming out of places like Gaza, the stories that are moving people the most is when people are giving names. It's not a nameless person in a hopeless situation. It is now a person that we are unhappy that they are in that situation, because we have gone on a journey with them by learning about them, even if they are in the same place. Alternatively, we might have a situation where you've got a story on your table, which we will talk about later if we have time, where we have someone who is in a sad situation, is given an opportunity and moves beyond. Okay, so there has been shift and movement. That is the definition of a story. Think of the 3 steps. Prior position, change, after position. The after position might be the same as the prior position, but there is movement backwards and forwards. Okay. Too many things. Okay, so one of the reasons we use story, and we're going to go into the details for every single one of these. One of the reasons we use story is because it changes the way people receive, respond to, and recall information. If you think about yourself as a transmitter of information, the only thing that you really want is for your audience to be able to receive it correctly, to respond to it in a meaningful way, and, very important for change making, to be able to recall it later on. Why is it important that people can recall information later on? Like, just think about it. You're trying to create transformational learning. What is it about the recollection that makes it so important? Yes? I'm saying, why is it important that people are able to recall the information they receive if you are talking about transformational learning and change making? Yes? What's that? Yes? But why do you want people to remember? Why is it important that they can recall what the information is about?
Sometimes they're able to relate to their own situations in real life.
Yes. Well, basically, it's application, right? People can't apply information if they leave it behind when they walk out the room. Okay? It's very, very difficult. So the recollection part is vital. So using story affects what we remember, it affects what we understand, it affects how we feel and in what way we will act. All of these, I'm sure you will agree, are very useful tools. Whether you are an educator, whether you are a change maker, whether you are a campaigner, whether you are working in a huge organization, whether you are working in a grassroots organization, what would the benefit be of a tool that enabled you as a educator, for example, to control the way individuals relate to information? I mean, I think it's about effectiveness, right? If you can't guarantee that people are going to relate to or react to your information, they're not going to use it properly. Okay. So why does story work? Why do we use story as a memory tool as an example? Stories give listeners a plot to follow, and if you have a plot, you can organize your thoughts and you can recall everything better. Think about the way that you remember a song versus the way you remember a piece of blank text. If you have a tune, you can remember the words, right? If I give you a paragraph to remember, you're not going to remember it. If I give you a song, you will remember the words very quickly after hearing it once or twice. Story works in the exact same way. It gives you a thread around which to organize your thoughts. Interestingly enough, the hierarchy of information, so what we call the hierarchy of information is the things your brain follows, the order that your brain follows things in. If you are asked to remember a story, if you are asked to remember a narrative, the first thing that you will remember is the way you felt when you heard it. After that, you will remember the structure of the story. The third thing you'll remember, and the least likely thing you will remember, are the factual elements. So the names, the dates, the times. You will remember how you felt. You might remember what happened, and you're least likely to remember those sort of concrete facts. But what do we do, sort of almost by habit, whenever we are giving someone information? We start with the facts. That's what people do. And then we wonder why people aren't taking the information we give them and working with it and and using it. This is what storytelling undoes. It undoes that sort of situation. We are all, and listen, now we're going to go into some brain science. And I'm not a biologist, but I've done a lot of work on neuroscience and the way story affects the brain. I'm not going to give you sort of brain scans, but it is very, very interesting, especially if you're a nerd like me. One of the things that happens is that the brain is hardwired for story. There are a lot of sort of linguists who think that the way language developed is through story. And one of the reasons for that is because story allowed people to, it gave people a reason to share information, but also it gave people sort of the memory of the plot and the memory of the narrative forced people to find unified ways of talking about things. Because if you were just listing objects, there's very little through lines. We are all hardwired to find stories memorable, and for a very important reason. If you look at someone's brain when they are listening to a story that is emotional, a story that sort of makes the emotional centers of the brain light up, what you have happening is both the left and the right sides of the brain. And if you know anything about the brain, you know the right side is the emotional, artistic side, the left side is the reasonable, logical side. When they both shine on a sort of scanner, what we know is more brain activity, which is what happens when you listen to a story as opposed to just a list of information. The more the brain lights up, the more likely people are to recall what they are using. The more parts of the brain which are active, the better the brain can use and access that information. And a story is unique in that it makes both sides of the brain light up. A story, because it involves character, because it involves emotion, lights up the creative and sort of human-centered part of the brain. Because it involves a plot, because it involves information happening in a sequence, it also lights up the rational and sort of logical side of the brain. And a more engaged brain does create more retention of memory. It also does a very interesting thing where regardless of the medium you are using, all parts of the brain light up. So if you are showing someone a film, even though it is visual and sound, the receptors in the brain that we know are part of smell, that are part of hearing, that are part of smell, that are part of touch, also light up. So there's a sort of what they call like a secondary effect on other parts of the brain. If you are simply using text, the parts of the brain that you reference in the text light up. So if you describe a smell in a story, the part of the brain which recognizes smells lights up. It's a very interesting thing, but it's a very important tool because you are trying to make someone's brain light up as much as you can. As a communicator, your key role is to make someone's brain light up. Like, I almost want you to think about that. That is your job. As an educator, as a communicator, you want someone's brain to light up. The more their brain lights up, the better you are doing in terms of making them understand and recall what you're talking about.
Can I ask a question
Yes.
before you continue?
Yes.
Yes. So from what you just said, I believe that context matters a lot
Yes.
when it comes to storytelling.
Yes.
Because if, for instance, you are telling a story about the four types of weather,
Yes.
and you use the four that we know, winter, spring, summer, autumn, and I'm coming from a context where there are only two,
Yes.
dry season and wet season.
Yes.
So your beautiful story about the four types of weather may not relate. I mean,
Yes.
it wouldn't really tell me anything.
Yes.
So I believe the context really is critical. So in all this, if I'm not relating and it doesn't resonate because this is a very unfamiliar story that I can't relate. I mean, if I have no idea about a Cinderella story and I know something about Kwaku Anansi's story, which is in my context, so I guess my point is the context really is important. It may not work as it is based on the context.
So that is what story does, which is where it also comes in as an important thing, is a well-told story will include multiple moments, and we'll get into this, where there are chances to connect. So if your whole story relied on someone understanding a dry season and a wet season, but they come from a place where there's autumn and winter and fall and rainy season, like, that wouldn't work so well. But because you're using story, you have more options at your disposal. And you have multiple ways of that person connecting to the story and multiple ways of people connecting to the content you are trying to share. So you go through, we'll get into it, but there are multiple points of connection. So yes, you should always remember as a storyteller, yes, that your audiences might come from a different context to you. But there is something inherent about the way stories work on the brain that even beyond those very specific contextual descriptors, character, for example, would carry that. And a well-told story will make sure that you overcome any kind of immediate contextual boundaries. But I don't want you to get hung up on specifics like a linguistic tool, because we're going to go into why stories using character will overcome that. Because one of the things that stories do as well is it is the only way I feel that you can really overcome contextual difference. So we'll talk about why that happens. Also, what I've got here is like, so the more pathways you open, so you might have, for example, the story about winter, a story about dry seasons, they don't match up. But a story will also include information where there are more chances to connect. So if you're just talking about, if you're describing winter, that's fine. But that's also describing winter isn't a story. Describing a character experiencing cold weather who goes through, that is a story. See, so there's multiple places to connect, but you'll see what I mean when we go through it. Have you ever heard read about the idea that humans are hardwired to find faces and things? There are a lot of people that think that our brains work the same way when it comes to story. That we are always trying to find story. That story is almost like a biological reaction to the world. And so if we find patterns, we are more likely to recall things, we are more likely to be engaged in it. The elements of a story are expected and predictable, and what I mean by that isn't that all stories follow the same pattern, but we are all familiar with the idea of story, and this is something that I need to be very clear on. I don't believe in the idea of universals because we don't exist in a world where everyone comes from the same context. But there is something inherent about story and their structure which is sort of universal the world over. And it doesn't matter the context, and it doesn't matter if the contexts are unrelated. There is a universality to the structure of stories. And one of the ways I always sort of illustrate this is that if someone shows me a story and we kind of understand the idea of an introduction, the idea of a crisis moment, and the idea of a conclusion, people go, oh yes, that's a very Western structure of story. But then you show them a film, like a sort of a crazy avant-garde film, and they'll go, yes, but that film's different because it starts at the end. To which the question is, how do you know it's starting at the end? There's still an inherent understanding of the sort of passage of time, which a story takes advantage of. So that is a predictability, and we look for predictability. We look for order in things. We look for that. And it creates a very specific chemical response, which we are going to exploit. And it sounds very sneaky to exploit people's brains, and it sounds very sort of something that the horrible sort of politicians would do. But ultimately, these are the tools we have as change makers, and we should use them. So we are going to exploit the brain's chemical response to a story. And I'm going to teach you how to do that. It's very exciting. And like I said, I know I said you can't change people's brains, and I know you can't go in and manually change their thoughts, but what we can do is manipulate the way that their chemicals respond to things. So the first chemical, and it's all of our favorite chemical, we don't even realize it, is dopamine. So dopamine is what we call the reward chemical. So dopamine is something that your brain seeks out all the time. People who are addicted to things are normally addicted to the dopamine rush that whatever they are addicted to gives them. It is released during any emotionally charged story, but most importantly, it is released when an expectation is met. When we go, we think this is going to happen, and then it happens, we get an incredibly satisfying dopamine rush. That is a very important thing to manipulate, and it is an important thing to sort of be aware of as you are using story. One of the things I always say is that, you know, I don't have children, but I know people, friends of mine who do, and their kids always ask for the same story to be read again and again and again at bedtime. And you're like, why do you want to hear the same story again and again and again? It's because it's predictable. It's because it increases the dopamine response when what you are expecting is given to you. So children are very, very receptive to it. And even as babies, they seek it out. So we need to exploit that. And I'll show you how to exploit it. It creates this feeling of satisfaction and then a feeling of engagement. So if you ever listen to a story or watched a film and you feel really engaged with it, that is your dopamine receptor kicking in. That is your dopamine thing going, oh, this is really enjoyable. And it's different to anxiety. It's different to excitement. It's satisfaction. Also, if you are getting a dopamine rush, you will remember what was happening when you felt that dopamine rush. We know that dopamine aids in memory. People who have ADHD, for example, they lack dopamine response. So if you imagine that that is what is happening with someone who lacks a dopamine response, imagine the opposite. And what we are trying to do is create a dopamine response, a sense of satisfaction, a sense of engagement, and then retention and memory, which follows on from that. In fact, it's very interesting because a lot of the studies around brain chemicals come from studies of people who have deficiencies or problems with those chemicals. So we see what happens when people don't have the chemical more than we do than when people have a large amount of the chemical. The second, and if you think about this as transformational learning, and a very, very important chemical is oxytocin. And this is what we call the love chemical. Oxytocin is what your brain releases when you are feeling cuddly and loved up and in love and happy and warm and snuggly. That's what oxytocin does to you. It also, very importantly for storytelling, happens when you are introduced to a character. If a human recognizes another human, you don't have to cuddle them, you don't have to hug them. If you recognize another human, your brain releases a rush of oxytocin. It doesn't matter how you feel about the person. The fact that another human is present releases that. And in storytelling, we've measured that when people hear the name of a character, when an individual is given a name, there's an oxytocin release in the listener, which is fascinating because if you think about how people normally frame information about social issues, often it's through anonymous participation in workshops. It's through anonymous survey results. There's a huge emphasis on depersonalizing the information because it's considered a sensitive way to share it. What you do with that is you make it less effective because one of the important things is that oxytocin creates empathy. So we know that when people are given oxytocin, they respond more quickly to pain in other people. So their empathy goes way up very, very quickly when oxytocin receptors are active. And when people have deficiencies in oxytocin, like when we've seen people who've had brain damage which reduces their oxytocin response, they cannot recognize pain in other people. It's a very interesting thing. One of the first things that happens is that they cannot recognize sort of like the external visual sort of indications of pain in other people. They stop being able to recognize that. And a very important thing that happens as well is that it reduces anxiety. And we know that when people are talking about change making, when we are trying to create behavior change in other people, create trust in other people, we need to reduce anxiety because anxiety raises it turns on the part of your brain that is a fear center and that shuts down your ability to feel empathy. So we want to control that oxytocin. We want to use names. We want to use characters that are human so that we can make oxytocin happen. And then the last and very important one which happens in storytelling, and all chemicals are firing when you are telling a story, but these are the three that we want to be thinking about. Cortisol is the stress hormone. Now, we all know cortisol because we are always told that we have too much of it because the world is a horrible, stressful place. Cortisol is not good long term. It makes you sick, it gives you heart disease. We don't want it. But in the context of storytelling, it is very important because if we allow someone listening to a story to experience conflict or to experience a dissonance, remember I said like there's a lack of satisfaction, there's a lack of satisfying response, the cortisol level goes up. What happens when cortisol goes up is you create a feeling of urgency. And the best thing you can do if you want to create change is create a sense of urgency. And it also aids in heightening attention. So if you've ever been in a stressful, your attention is heightened, people will concentrate more on your messaging. they'll remember it better. Also, very interestingly, there's something which happens when cortisol and oxytocin are released at the same time, which is unique to story, because there are very few situations in the world where oxytocin and cortisol are released at the same time. And it creates something where empathy is combined with urgency. And that creates something which we call transportation. So people are able to imagine themselves in a different situation. And if you are trying to create empathy, if you are trying to create change, the most important thing you can do is make someone imagine that they are somewhere they are not, that they are feeling something they are not, that they are identifying with a character who they are not. Right, does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions on that? I know it's like a brain science lesson, but it's very important to understand that this stuff is not just wishy-washy. It is based in brain science. And quite often when I talk about storytelling, yes, we understand storytelling, but I'm talking to people who need to convince other people that storytelling is worth investing in, that storytelling is worth making time for, and that storytelling is worth putting resources behind. And quite often they find this quite useful. Yes?
Sorry, maybe you're going to get into this, but could you give an example of a way of using story where cortisol and oxytocin is combined?
So if you imagine a story where you simply have a character, so you've got a character, so immediately oxytocin, you've named someone called Blessing, walks into a room, right? So we've already, oxytocin has gone up because now we don't just have a woman walking into a room, we have Blessing walking into a room. But something happens to Blessing that makes her stressed. Blessing is unhappy, she's sad. What's going on? What's happened to Blessing? You've already got you've immediately got the dissonance because you've got there's a sense of discombobulation there, but you've also got a name. So it is as simple as that combination of factors to start that process from happening. But if you imagine the full thread of a story, imagine Cinderella. We've got Cinderella. We're starting to identify her. Cinderella's sad. Cinderella's got a horrible life. We've got both of them starting to happen again. Okay, and by the end of the story, the oxytocin lags behind, by the way. Dopamine is the first response, oxytocin is slower. So as the story develops, oxytocin goes up and up and up and up and up. And unless Cinderella has a happy ending, we're going to be in a state of transportation. We are going to be going, we want to make Cinderella's life better. Okay? These are small manipulations, and it's basically about it's names and discomfort. And you've got both. Okay. Basically any story. Remember I explained the story was the beginning state, the change state, and then back to the beginning state or to a new state. It's this state here that'll make the cortisol happen. It's this change, this conflict. Okay. I'm going to go back to values. So one of the important things about story as well is that it helps people interpret facts and see the bigger picture. So this is a bit like what you were asking about the weather and the different kinds of seasons, the different parts of the world. You might not understand something through description, but through story, you start to see the bigger picture because you can see the consequences and you can see the context because it is made apparent through story. Story gives you the space to do that. And one of the ways that we always talk about history, for example, is as a series of stories. And one of the reasons that if you think about, there's a tendency, for example, amongst dictators and fascists to try and reduce the teaching of history. And one of the reasons we do that is because you don't want to make context and consequences apparent. Because if people can understand their world through context and consequences, the meaning of what is happening around them becomes very apparent. So we are trying to do the opposite with story. We are trying to make context and consequences apparent. Because story gives you that space to do so. I want some examples. I want you to give me some ideas about what the difference is between values and identity. If I talk to you about values and I talk to you about identities, what is the difference?
I think values tend to be more universal in general. Different sets of people can ascribe to the same values, while identity has to do with a personal interpretation of yourself, and that is more personal. Yeah.
Values are what we taught, and identity is what we are showing.
Okay. Anyone else?
Sorry, thank you. Also, identity can be something that is used to describe a person based on action that has been taken, while values are more internal and
So that's a very important point. So my definition of the two, and it's I think it's an important distinction, is that identity is an external descriptor. So your identity is normally externally imposed because it is in relation to external factors. So you are female because the world around you divides the world into male, female, and others. You are Asian because the world is divided into different groups. Identity is something which is externally imposed. It is also what is externally it is externally apparent, and I don't just mean in terms of like physicality. I mean, I don't mean apparent in that sense. I mean in that it is something that someone else would describe you as. Values are internal and they are self-created. What is really interesting is that people often talk about shared identities as a means for connection. So because I'm female, I'm going to connect with you because you're female, right? But that's using external factors and external things which I have not chosen to connect us. And identities also come with a lot of assumptions. So as, for example, as a female, people assume that I might understand motherhood, or that I might understand being a daughter, or that I might understand being a sister, or any of these other things that go along with identity. So a lot of times people try and create connection through identity. And you'll see that when people talk about representation, they'll talk about like representation in film. And yes, that's important. It's important for a number of reasons. But that alone does not create connection. What creates connection is values, because what we find is that people gather around shared values. If you are trying to make social change happen, if you are trying to encourage social movements to happen, it's no good to say, get a bunch of people from the same religion into a room, or get a bunch of people who are of the same culture into a room. What works is to say, get a bunch of people into the room who share the same values, and then change will happen. And story is the only place where value can be expressed, because it's through exploring character and motivations that you have space to talk about values and what people find important and how people self-identify in terms of their values. And obviously, the more space you have for value sharing, the more space you have for connection. You know, I think it's also been a very interesting thing, because what we've seen through time, and with sort of storytelling, and this is an example that's often used, is, you know, a few years ago when you looked at film, there wasn't much sort of LGBT representation. We're talking 20 years ago. And people thought it was enough to start putting gay characters into films, thinking that that would somehow satisfy a need for identification and a need for connection. But what you find is that people then say, this is not enough because these characters don't share my values. And people are more likely to gather around shared values than they are around identity, which, as I said, is externally opposed and changes according to the context you are in. Right? If I'm standing in a room, my identity in this room is as the person standing in front of the room. That will change when I go into another room full of men and I'm going to be the only woman in the room. That'll change when I go into another room and I'm the only South African in the room. So you can't connect to me on my identity. You can only connect to me through my values, because whether I'm in that room or that room, I'm a person who cares deeply about human rights. Right? So that is where a story will allow you to explore identity. It'll give you space to do so. That's what I've just said. And also, because there are no universals, because we are dealing in a world where you know, I approach you as a woman, you approach me as a speaker, I approach you as a man from India, I approach you as a man from Nigeria. Like, there is no universal, but we are all people who are interested in transformation, right? So that is important to us as well. And while there may be no universals, what we also know is that story, when we listen to stories, goes back to the brain science, we connect because it's called there's something we have in the brain called mirror neurons. It's a very interesting thing. If I'm reading a story about a little girl called Coco who lives in Kyoto, and she is very scared because she's scared of snakes, and she finds a snake in her bedroom. When I'm listening to that story, my fear neurons are starting to fire. I have no connection to a little girl in Kyoto. But because my neurons are firing, I'm starting to relate to her. Because, yeah, it's just something which, it's what happens when we listen to story. We live it as if it is actually happening to us. Okay. Now, characters, I've spoken about this oxytocin response when you hear a name, right? But beyond that response, we also have an opportunity to use characters in a different sense. When we are describing change making, when we are describing a context which requires change, we struggle as people who live in the world and experience the world to change our point of view. We struggle to see anything outside of our immediate lens. I was talking to someone yesterday and describing it as the difference between navigating a maze where you only have your view versus a three-dimensional view of that maze where you can see it from the top. A story lifts your view into that three-dimensional view where you can see the maze from the top as opposed to just the wall in front of you. And you can navigate a system that way. Because what a story does is it takes you out of your immediate environment, out of your immediate lens, and lets you take a step out of it so you can see everything in relation to a system. If you are going to develop solutions that are systems-based or that affect systems, you need to be able to do that. And you need to be able to view a situation from the outside. And that includes understanding one's own impact or potential impact on a system. Through story, you can see the relationship between an individual and a system, and you can imagine the impact of individual choices on a system. It also includes the navigation of intersectional issues and obstacles, because through imagining a character in a system, you can imagine the multitude of factors and influences that act upon them. So too often I think we talk about systems change, when we talk about change making, we abstract. So we don't talk about the solutions with a consideration of the various intersectional challenges or obstacles that an individual might navigate. A story is a place to explore that, both in action and in imagination. And I think, you know, one of the things about story, especially when it comes to systems, is that what we find is that characters represent parts of a system, and that's the exercise that I've got for you just now. Characters represent parts of that system, and you can see how they impact each other and relate to each other as well. This is, I spoke about this. So basically, two very interesting things happen as well when you are telling a story, is that there is a relationship between a storyteller and a listener, right? We've spoken about the chemical response. But story has always been a social activity since the dawn of time. And one of the things that story does is, if you are telling a story, you create a relationship between the speaker and the listener. This is not a relationship between the character who's at the center of the story and the issue. I'm talking specifically about the narrator in the situation. But the closer the narrator is to the issue, the closer the listener becomes to the issue because of that relationship between the listener and the narrator. That's one of the reasons when we are doing change-making storytelling, it's really important to sometimes make the voice of the person most affected, because that is the shortcut to allowing an audience to access the issue, because that neural coupling, which happens between the storyteller and the listener, we need to exploit that. So the closer the listener, the closer the storyteller is to the issue, whether that person is affected by the issue or is speaking on behalf of someone, it's a very important choice to make, because you are going to locate the audience in response to the issue based on who the speaker is. And the other thing which I spoke about is the mirroring, which is an important path to empathy, because the effect on the listener is that they share the feelings which the characters in the story experience. It's very interesting. That mirror neurons is one of the reasons that you yawn if someone else yawns. Or if I even speak about yawning, you might yawn. Maybe you're just yawning because you're bored. But if I start talking about yawning and you start yawning, that's your mirror neurons firing. Okay. And it's also similar, like if you put readers on someone who's watching a scary film, and they your heart starts going up if you have a scared character on the screen, even if it's a bad horror movie. If you're watching someone who's scared, you feel more scared. And they've proven that if someone has the whites of their eyes showing in a film, the fear response in the audience goes up, because they understand that. Strange but true. So the dopamine thing that I spoke about, and I told you that was very, very important. And this is where I don't like talking about manipulating people, because it sounds really like, nice people who make change don't manipulate people. But the reality is, what we need to do is we need to be influencing. And this is an important way to do it. We spoke about a story as a before state, the action, the decision making, the change situation happens, and then either you go back to the before state and you're unsatisfied, we want better change to happen, or we are happy that there is a solution, or the solution's not great. What we want to do, remember the audience is craving that dopamine. We have a choice whether to give them that dopamine or not. We are incredibly powerful because they are craving that dopamine, and we can give it to them or we can choose not to. And if we choose not to because the solution is inadequate or the solution is lacking or the change has not yet happened, what are they going to do? What do you think they're going to do? They're going to fill in the gaps. And what they're going to do is, if you give them an option to take action, they will take that action to make that change happen so that they feel satisfied because the story has not yet completed. And we see this again and again and again we see it with right-wing politicians, unfortunately, who instill fear in people and then refuse to give a sense of safety and then say, take action to stop your fear. So you get the right-wing vote happening, unfortunately. That's one of the ways they use it. But what we also have is campaigns and change-making campaigns, which are based on the idea that people want a satisfying conclusion. So they will present a problem. They will present a potential solution, a future that can look like this. And then they'll take it away from you and say, oh, but it doesn't. And you've got to do X, Y, Z to make that change happen. And that's how you create that. And that's how you create sort of mass change and mass movement. And it really does work in an astonishing way. It's a well-studied thing. Or alternatively, what we can do sometimes, because you don't want to be horrible, you don't want people to be lacking all the time, you can also give them a sense that the solution that you are proposing, the change that you are wanting, makes them feel good. Because you have created this expectation that dopamine is coming, that happy chemical, the thing that makes them feel really satisfied is going to come at the end of it all. And then you give it to them. And they're like, we are now convinced by your argument. We are convinced that the change you are proposing is the change we most want. And that is a way you manipulate them, through happily ever afters or not having happily ever afters. If the best way to make someone watch the next episode of a show is to end on cliffhanger. That's what you're doing with story all the time if you're wanting to create change. You give them cliffhangers, and so they crave more. Or they come back for more information at its most benign. which is what I've just said. Does anyone have any questions about that process? That process of sort of manipulating your audience's brain through story? Everyone totally understands brain science. No questions? Does anyone have an example of when you were told a story that you craved a different outcome for? Or something which left you in a state of, I want to know more, or a state of, I'm now convinced by the story that the solution is attainable, achievable, or something that is good for everyone?
Yeah, so I have heard same story from two different people, and the impact was completely different.
Yes.
And my assumption is that depending on how the story is told or how the story is shared, the impact could be different. So in my case, same story. One of them, nothing at all. I didn't feel anything. The other one, I felt it. And I had a lot of reflections. So it also depends sometimes on the one telling the story and also the person even listening or hearing the story. So there are some of these dynamics as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is a level of skill, but what is interesting, and this is something that and this is one of the reasons that I break it down into sort of the building blocks when people learn story, is because a lot of storytelling is just checking boxes. And that, yes, it might not be the most effective way of telling story, but because story is what it is, it will still produce those chemical responses. It might be a muted version, but there's almost no way around it. It's an automatic part of the engagement. Unless you were completely disengaged, those chemical reactions would have been happening. And one of the important things to remember as well is that story very seldom, if ever, does or should live in isolation. You very seldom hear one story. You hear multiple stories, and you create your ideas based on multiple stories. And so we are hearing stories all the time. Every time you turn on the news, every time you open a newspaper, every time you read anything, you are hearing multiple stories. And all of those stories are having small effects on you. They are having small cumulative effects on you. So if you have an amazing storyteller, unfortunately Donald Trump was a very good storyteller, and I hate that that was the fact, because it meant that he could speak to one audience once and make them change their minds. And that's very dangerous. And often the worst manipulators in history have been the best storytellers, because they can change the mind of an audience with one story. And also the other part of that is that there has been a tendency when it comes to sort of campaigning that the sort of positive change makers have been far more reticent about using manipulative tactics. But ultimately everyone's brains are wired the same. So we've got the same toolbox. So the better the storyteller is, yes, the better your reaction to it be, or the worse your reaction to be, depending on the story. But very seldom will you be hearing a story in isolation or telling a story in isolation. You'll be usually be using it alongside other information as well as a change maker. But it's also very important to be aware of the impact of story when you are an audience. You know what I mean? Like, one of the important things is to remember is that as an audience, all these things are happening in your brain. And just because you understand that they are happening doesn't mean you can stop them from happening, but you can be aware that your logical and critical response might be very different to your emotional response, which is an unregulated and involuntary response. We know one of the things that we speak about when we speak about media literacy, for example, is taking that critical step back so that the stories that we are being told do not influence our behavior immediately. Which is why it sometimes seems strange to advocate for storytelling when I'm saying be careful of story. But we have to sort of navigate this kind of strange space as positive change makers, because like I said, the toolbox that we have is exactly the same as the toolbox the bad side has, as the people that would limit freedoms and would limit democracy and limit all the things that we hold dear. We have to be very, very careful, and we have to be cognizant all the time. So yes, at its core, and again, it goes back to the ideas. If a story is a real story, if a story takes you from here to the change, back or forward, it will have that effect on you, even if it's told badly. So basically, when you are dealing with audiences, I mean, that's one of the things about understanding, understanding your audience from the moment that you start telling a story. I think it's important to understand where they are in the journey as well, because remember, as a storyteller, you need to make sure that you are giving them dopamine every now and again. Like again, it's like you are lighting up their brains. So like I said, the one thing you need to do is light up their brains. If you are no longer engaging them from the story level, the change-making effect will be limited, because you will no longer manipulate the end, this response, the feeling that they're left with at the end. You've lost that ability to manipulate that. But engagement is a difficult thing, because especially and one of the things that I have to say about dopamine is that we are living in a dopamine deficient age. Engagement is incredibly limited because of the fact that we now get sort of short-term dopamine hits all day long because of the way the world works. It used to be quite different. Back in the glory days of sort of old storytellers of yore, people would come to you for your story and they'd be like, Rev, it doesn't happen anymore, because people are constantly getting tiny hits of dopamine, which A, means they don't crave it anymore in the way that they used to, but it also means that the impact of it is far more, it's like if you take any drug over time, the impact will be less and less and less and less. The same thing happens with dopamine. So it is far more difficult to keep your audience engaged. That is why people do turn to whistles and bells and shiny tactics to try and keep audiences engaged. It's also one of the reasons that I always say as well that the most important thing you can do as a communicator is make sure that you are using names, getting the oxytocin going, doing all the things that you can control. If you have the resources, you will tell better stories. If you have the skills, you will tell better stories. But if you are ticking the boxes, you will be doing that. And you must just keep trying and trying again and again and again. I think the difficulty comes in as well is when sometimes people are in situations when they think they've only got one chance to tell a story. They've got it's very seldom the case, because you will be speaking, if you're an educator, you will be speaking to classrooms again and again and again and again. You will be making sure that people, this is going to be important, you are going to be making sure that people are repeating those stories on your behalf. Because the more people can remember, so the more you have gone into the sort of recollection part of people's brains, the more people have engaged so that they can recall things, the more they will share them with others. And so the power of those stories, even if engagement is small, starts to multiply. Okay, so the multiplier effect, especially in this day and age, especially with social media, is super, super important. If you have made them understand, if you have made them relate, the more they'll be able to recognize opportunities to share those stories as well. Because the more people have gone, that makes me think of that thing, that makes me think of that thing, the more they will be reminded to share that story. The more that they will feel, the more likely they are to share it. We know that the more deeply we feel something, the more likely we are to repeat it. And the more we've left them in a state of wanting to act, the more likely they will be to seek out opportunities. Remember that sort of that looking for dopamine. They will be looking for opportunities to hit that dopamine high, and they will be looking out opportunities to share their stories with others to create more change. That multiplier effect will come into play. So, yeah. Remember, like, every story is a small story that we, if we are doing it correctly, we want it to be repeated, we want it to be amplified, we want it to be multiplied. And especially if you come from a change-making and campaigning world, that multiplier effect is key, because you will never have enough people in a single room to make a change. So you are relying on the idea of the ideas being taken forward. Does anyone have any questions about this from a sort of educational point of view, or from a sort of transformational sort of point of view, when you are thinking about making change in individuals or groups, why that multiplier effect is so important, or how it works? I assume not. Yes, so why does it matter so much? Because change doesn't happen in a room. It happens in the world, and it happens over time. So if you cannot be ensuring that the messaging that you're putting out in a room, the story that you're sharing in a room, goes beyond the learning space, beyond the sort of sharing space of that story, you will be limiting the change that story will produce, or the change that story will affect. Does anyone have any? thoughts on that, experiences of that.
Yeah, one of the stories that was recorded this year, one of the teachers that carried out a project in Nigeria, not a teacher actually, she's just a GCD practitioner. She said that the reason why she chose to work with school teachers was because they have multiplier effect. That's what she's called it. That if you train with a single teacher in a year, the teacher can train up to 50 or 60 students, depending on the size of the class. And that teacher can keep teaching that same skill that she has learned to different children over the years. So that was what she talked about, multiplier effect, and I can see some similarities between that driving transformation from training the trainer. The message cascades down to different people.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, that's what we always spoke about when we spoke about viral things on social media, right? It's the same thing. It's the same kind of idea. And also remember, in a world where that is a way of spreading information, this becomes more important, you know, because now there is more competition in the space. There is more competition for information sharing. And also remember, your brain doesn't make a hierarchy. So if you're getting information from social media, you don't suddenly hear information in a classroom and think it's more important. Your brain does not have a hierarchy of information in that sense. It has a hierarchy in terms of how it remembers things. You know, the thing I said, you remember emotion first, then you remember the narrative, then you remember the facts. That's the hierarchy your brain has. That is how your brain defines your informational sort of centers. It does not have a hierarchy of sources or anything as logical as that. It goes straight to the emotion. So it becomes really, really important that the positive messaging, or the messaging that is going to encourage change making, has half a chance against the other messaging and the other stories that are being shared, no matter where the spaces are, no matter where they're coming from. I mean, just think about it for yourself. What makes you want to repeat a story? If you've heard a story, what makes you go, oh, I must tell you this thing I heard? Like, what makes you do that? What is the impetus that makes you do that as a listener? The shock factor. But why do you think the shock factor makes you do that? And what if you felt terrible? Do you want someone else to feel terrible? Your pity party. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the whole thing of good wins over the evil, because that has had an effect on me. I think if I share that further, that might help someone else as well. So the idea that, because this is also, I feel, a world where we're constantly, as teachers, this is something that I have heard a lot, that, okay, this is all in your books. No, you cannot really bring about a change. And when I see a story where there is some kind of a dopamine that I'm getting, that change that is actually happening, the good finally wins, I get that thing that no, I can actually bring about a change, and I would want to share that with more people who are struggling because of the system, or because of the idea that, oh, we cannot actually do anything about the reality.
And what triggers, beyond going, because I mean, people don't hear a story and then walk into a room and go, I need to tell someone else the story. They very seldom do that, right? What is it that reminds you to tell someone a story?
So it's the context. Something in the situation maybe reminds you of the story.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. But that's also one of the reasons when I say, like, the more chances there are for connection, the more chances there are that in a different space there'll be those triggers. So the more options you give people to remember it later on, the more likely that'll happen.
I wanted to briefly ask as well, then, is it very important to focus on the resolution if you want positive change? Because especially with like social media, a lot of the stories and the information is like just to get people feeling, it's like just the shock value. It's like just for people to sit in this and be angry. And
So here's the interesting, there's a very interesting thing about that. So those stories, those sort of shock value stories on social media, they very seldom are satisfying, right? And what happens is that because people are craving satisfaction, those stories, they often have a very short shelf life. because they get shared, and then people lose interest quite quickly because remember, dopamine keeps you engaged. So people share those stories, but they often then fall off or are replaced with other narratives very, very quickly. So we see that cycle of social media. And what that is, that's a lot of shock value with very little satisfaction. And so people will find more. So people will click on another thing, and they'll click on another thing, and they'll click on another thing. So that's what's happening in that sort of social media space. So maybe if you bear that in mind, there's an opportunity for you to go, I'm going to give people the satisfaction of a solution, and your story will have longer staying power, and therefore more transformational power. I know you had something to say.
I think the question, the conversation went ahead, but just wanted to share that the things which I feel like I should share that story is like I connect with the characters basically. So the elements around the character which makes me think like, oh, it's interesting. So this is something which I should share. That, and then the plot, and then that's a different thing which I don't think. But I connect more with the character.
So are you suggesting that the story has a resolution?
I'm suggesting that you decide if it has a resolution depending on what change you want to make. It can have but remember, stories are very seldom in isolation. So what I recommend that people always do is that if you have a multiplicity of stories, some of them suggest the solution. So people have an understanding what that solution could be, how it could look, that sense of satisfaction. And then other versions of the story, other characters, other people in the same environment still require that change. They still require that. So then in those situations, there's still the impetus for action to create change in the audience.
Usually, I really like films, and I like the films with the open end.
Yeah.
And, make you, wonder about what it would be like, and, multiple possibility of interpretations instead of any story with
happy ending.
a solution. I will be very unsatisfied with a satisfying ending.
So you're a difficult one. You're one of them. No, but it is interesting because you'll find often in those situations that those films are very, very carefully crafted because you don't want an audience which all leaves unsatisfied. So they're doing something else. And that's a craft thing. That's less about the structure of the story as much as it is about the craft around the film.
I think it's rather kind of strategic choice and also pedagogical choice.
Yeah.
And what you are dealing with, who you are doing the things. But for me, always developing eyes to see the complexity and understand, kind of accept ambiguity of life and things are very important, because I often see that whether it is progressive and or kind of ultra right wing, the problem with the binary kind of opposition, the kind of thinking, binary thinking, is very dangerous and. So for me, when I think of critical empowerment, yes, it's unsatisfied, satisfactory. So that it's actually it's difficult. You suffer, but you have to think through, right? So I think I get the point of yours. How the satisfying story is really empowering, but at the same time. Also, when you think of critical thinking, then...
But here's the thing. So there's another part of that lack of satisfaction. And what you'll find, for example, in those films where you don't have a satisfying resolution, you carry on thinking about them. So that's another tactic. So similarly to, if I say to you, you want the resolution, sign this petition. That's a good way to get someone to sign a petition. But if you want someone to keep on thinking about an issue, that's a similar thing, because your brain will continue to scan and scan and scan for solutions, because your brain does want that dopamine hit. You can't stop it. So it's scanning and scanning and scanning. So that is a good way to keep people critically engaged, because whether you're giving them the option of an action to take or just letting them think about and ruminate on the issue, it's a similar model of what you're doing with the story. Yeah. Yeah.
I think also it's power dynamic too. Like, do I have the power to make the resolution, or the resolution is given, and I follow it? So I think we may feel more satisfaction when we are more participating and have a power or acknowledge that we have a power to make that resolution.
But that's another reason for the character dynamic, right? So if you have character, and character is very much the kind of through line through all story, characters make remember, systems don't make individual choices. Structures don't make choices. Individuals make choices. And so if you lead with a character, one of the things which happens is that there isn't a realization that choices are human driven. Remember I said that people exist in a system. And what a story does is it makes the character in a system very apparent, rather than seeing the world like this, where you can only see your own lens. And there's this thing called the unified lens theory. It's very the unified lens theory, and what that does, I don't necessarily agree with it, because what the unified lens theory says is that you have your lens. You see your world like this. I see my world like this. We will never make sense to each other. We will try, but we'll keep missing each other because we all have our own lenses. And our lenses are all set slightly differently. The unified lens theory says that if you present a story, if you present almost like a little diorama of what's happening in the world, then we're all stepping back and we're all looking at the same picture. So we can actually have a conversation, because now we are all looking at the same picture. I'm not happy with that, because what that does is it implies that suddenly we've removed our lenses. And the reality is that even if we are all talking about the same story, we still have our lenses. But what is going to change is that we are able, through transportation, through all these tactics, to put ourselves in the shoes of that person. We are more likely to have a more unified discussion, if not have the exact same conclusions, the exact same feelings about the issue. We can at least now start talking because we have a shared understanding of where things fit in relation to each other. And again, you're seeing that a lot at the moment with, like, we all know what's happening in the Middle East. There are two sides there who cannot talk to each other. They cannot talk to each other. So what you do is you go, well, here's this story. Here's this person in this situation. We aren't going to come as angry people from the side, or angry people from the side, or hurt people from the side. What we are going to do is we're going to talk about this man in this situation. And we are going to come to conclusions about this man in this situation and what's best for him. And we're all talking about the same man in the same situation. We haven't removed our lenses, but we are all now at least speaking the same conversation. So that is what story does. Yeah. Anyone? 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute.
Yeah, I just want to share about. So sometimes, like, most of the stories which we get exposed would take us to that cliff and edge, and like, and then sometimes it would be driven by fear. But I feel like, there should be more stories coming out which gives us hope, which would take us towards, like, that dream world that we really wanted to create. Because sometimes, like, this whatever we are exposed to, if we, like, we are being more exposed to fear, anxiety, and all those things. So we are kind of, like, leading towards manifesting more fear, more anxiety in our life, is what I feel like. When there is, like, more narrative coming about hope and the world which we really wanted, then there is, like, more manifestation of that good world, or, like, the better world.
And again, what story would do in that situation is make that alternative very tangible. So rather than, like I said, it's like you say, it's like a dream world. It's not a dream world. As soon as you put it in story, I can imagine it. And if I can imagine it, I can do it. And like, that sounds very wishy-washy. Oh, if you can dream it, you can be it. No, it's not that. It's that if your body has gone through the chemical manifestations of the story, I have felt the real feelings, I have seen them in action, my brain has made them concrete because it has been visualized in my head, which is a story will do, you are far more likely to be able to take steps towards it. Also, an interesting thing, and I know my time is up, is that when you create stories which have solutions, a very interesting thing happens, and this is actually a good place to stop. When you create solutions through story, your brain makes no distinction between remembering a real solution that you have seen in action and one that you have been has been described to you in story. You remember it the exact same way. So it is a wonderful way to start countering that narrative, because you will remember positive change as if it has already happened. And that makes it all the more possible and more and is very motivating for people to create change. Your brain does not know the difference between a story and real world. It's very sneaky, but it's true. We don't know. So what we are doing is we are creating a new reality through story. And that is what we can do. Okay. And there is so much about this. Sorry, I know my time is up. There is so much about this. Please email me. I have like 1 million pieces of information to share. This, like I said, this is years of learning. I've tried to do it in an hour. It's a lot of like words. So please, please get in touch, and I will share more resources with you and answer any questions.
Just a feedback, I haven't done your online course on storytelling, but now I feel I'll go and do that course on GCD online campus for sure. Thank you so much.